welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. So here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Jim Stewart. Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So Jim is a trauma survivor, having experienced 2 near-death events, as well as other traumas early in life. Having had a lifelong struggle with the impact of trauma in the past 6 years, Jim has embarked on a journey of healing. That's included both EMDR and BrainSpotting. Today, he's happy to say that he is now a survivor and he wishes to share his story of hope and healing with others. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you
originally from Wilmington, Delaware.
Okay.
That's where I grew up. Moved to Massachusetts to go to college, and then moved to Maine, where I currently live 10 years ago.
Okay. So East Coast, intense winters.
Sir. Yes.
How's the winter there now?
Actually, it's beautiful. It's a gorgeous sunny day, and it's not very cold, so I'm good with that.
All right. So how the heck did all this start?
Oh, boy. How did it all start? Well, I think probably the first significant trauma that I experienced, I was 18 years old and was 1 month from going off to college and got a phone call from my former girlfriend, who I had broken up with earlier that summer, that she was pregnant. This was 1968. There were really no options available to people in 1968. And the next thing I knew, I was summoned to my parents' home in Delaware. I went to college in Massachusetts and got married. Didn't want to. Scared out of my mind. But it's just the option that was made available to me. The odd thing about it was that I remember almost nothing of the 6 weeks prior to that marriage. I know that I was in the same room with my parents and my girlfriend's parents. I have zero recollection of one word that was said. Mm-hmm. I know I was there, but it's just a total blank. I have no recollection at all. Next thing I knew, and I don't have any recollection of the actual wedding. I have no recollection at all of that. I do remember leaving the reception and driving back to Massachusetts to go back to school. But the church ceremony, I have zero recollection of.
And how old were you at this time again?
18.
18.
And a very immature 18. Very.
So you get a call from your girlfriend. She says she's pregnant.
Yep.
You call back to your parents. You guys are getting married.
That's correct.
So how do things unfold?
So that's when I had my first experience with the impact of trauma. Was the wedding night. I experienced something that scared the hell out of me, and that was disassociation. I know that now because I've read about it and I know what disassociation is. But at the time that it happened, I was terrifying. I remember we were in a hotel in Connecticut, and my wife went in to change. And when she came out of the bathroom, all of a sudden, it's like like I was looking through the other end of a telescope. Mm-hmm. I felt this spatial separation, like I was, receding into the room somewhere. And I remember saying to myself, don't let this happen. This is bad. Don't go there. But I was so terrified. I only know that my body was present. I was not there. I was not in that room. And it scared the hell out of me. It really did, because I didn't know what was happening. And unfortunately, if I look back now as my healthy adult, I could think of all sorts of options that I might have chosen at that moment. But I honestly was frozen, completely frozen. And the next thing I know, we get up the next morning and drive back to Massachusetts, and I go back to school. But I knew something was wrong. Something had happened, and something that I did not understand. And I wasn't able to verbalize at all. I never discussed it. I didn't discuss it with my wife at the time. It was like I just blocked it out.
So did you, how long did you stay married?
9 years.
Okay. Wow.
I tried to make it work. I had a daughter, and that's the primary reason why I think I tried to make it work, is all of a sudden I'm 19 years old and I have a child. It was, I did my best, knowing that, I was terribly immature, but I did my best. And, so we were married for 9 years, but it was never really a marriage. It wasn't a marriage. It was, guess what, son, you're marrying her. That's what it was.
Right. So you said that was your first traumatic experience.
Yes.
Okay.
So the second one happened 2 years later. So I got a job. I worked nights, went to school. I actually graduated, so I give myself a lot of credit for that. I stayed in school. I got my degree. I had a job working night at a bank operations center. And this was 1968, 1969, 1970. Marijuana was really prevalent on campus. I knew nothing about drugs, nothing. But once I discovered pot, for me, it was the only time that I felt okay if I was high. I felt normal. I felt like all this weight that was on my shoulders was temporarily gone. And I liked it. I really enjoyed it. I had no interest in doing anything beyond marijuana. Had a real aversion to harder drugs, even though I had friends that did, mescaline and things like that, but I wanted nothing to do with that. So I used marijuana as an escape, basically. And the next traumatic event that happened to me, and this was probably the most serious traumatic event, was in February of 1970. So I was in my, I don't know whether I was in my sophomore or junior year. I don't really remember, but I was sitting in my living room on a Saturday night in February, and I do remember that it was 15 degrees below zero that night. It was a really, really, really cold winter. I think it was my sophomore year. And we would sit in my living room and listen to music and smoke pot. And all of a sudden, so I had all these feelings of being trapped and lost and scared, but I never dealt with them at all.
Regarding your marriage?
Yes.
Okay.
But I never dealt with those feelings. So those feelings just built up and built up and built up, but I really wasn't aware of that until that night. So that night, I don't know what time it was, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, I don't really remember. All of a sudden, I'm sitting in my living room and I look across the room at my wife, and this telescoping effect happened again. it felt to me like the room was moving, that my wife was moving away from me. Again, it was like looking through the opposite end of a telescope. It was really strange. But I panicked because I realized at that moment, all those feelings that I had repressed, all came out at once. And I realized I'm in this room with this person that I don't want to be with. I'm married. I don't want to be married. I have a child. I don't really want to have a child. And pure panic took over. And I don't remember a lot of what happened after that, but I do remember I jumped up and I just said, I have to get out of here. And I ran outside. I was wearing probably a shirt like I'm wearing now, dungarees. I think I had shoes on. And I ran outside, panicked. I felt like my heart was going to explode out of my chest. And all of a sudden, this 15-degree temperature hit me like a wall. And I started to hyperventilate. And that really frightened. I was terrified at that point because I couldn't stop. I just could not stop. I couldn't control my breathing. I was just like sucking in air and of course here I am sucking in 15 degrees below zero air, wearing a shirt and dungarees. Mm-hmm. So all of these strange thoughts started to come to me that had never occurred to me before. Like, for instance, this really got me going. I thought to myself, I'm sucking in air at such a rate that my brain might freeze. And, as I look back on it now, I probably was right. But I was in such a state of panic. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. And I just started to walk. I don't know. I couldn't have been more than 50 feet from my front door. And all of a sudden I looked down on the ground and I saw my dead body on the ground in front of me. Wow. Talk about escalating panic. And I looked down and I knew it was me. I knew it was, obviously it wasn't me, but I had this vision of me on the ground dead, and I could feel that pulling me down. And at that moment, I don't know what mode I went into. I just knew that if I stood there, I was going to die. And so I just ran. And from that moment on, I don't know what I know I ran and ran and ran and ran and ran for at least an hour. I have no recollection. All I remember, there was a full moon. I do remember that. But other than that, I don't remember going home. I don't remember going to bed. I don't remember waking up the next morning. And in all honesty, I remember almost nothing about maybe the next month or so after that. Somehow I pulled myself together and went back to school and went to class and did my job. But I was terrified. In all honesty, I thought I'd lost my mind.
Let me ask you something here, Jim. So in the bio, it said that you'd experienced trauma throughout your life, and
yes,
you are on a healing journey. At what point did you say to yourself, you know what, something is wrong? I need to get some help.
Almost immediately.
Okay. So take us there. What did that look like for you?
So I knew something was really wrong. I didn't know what it was. I knew I was not the same. I felt like I was damaged goods. And so, again, this is 1970. PTSD was not a phrase that trauma is not that well known today, but 1970,
right,
it wasn't even a word that was spoken.
Sure.
So I sought out 2 or 3 therapists, and I described to them what had happened. And there was one therapist who said to me, what I think you experienced was akin to combat fatigue. That was the closest that anybody knew about trauma in 1970. This was during the Vietnam War. And he said, you experienced what we would call combat fatigue. And I looked at him and I said, well, what do I do about this? And his response was, you'll grow out of it. I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grow out of it. I still felt broken, damaged, scared. I was really scared, really, really scared. And unfortunately, I didn't really have a support system around me. I mean, I was with somebody I didn't want to be with.
Mm-hmm. I
never really shared with her what happened that night, nor what had happened to me afterwards. And somehow, in spite of all this, I pulled it together. I graduated from college. I was a good dad to my daughter, and started a career. And my career was in human resources. That's basically where I've spent my entire career, in human resources. And I think slowly over time, the severity of the trauma diminished, but it was always in the background. Mm-hmm. I always still felt damaged. I always felt different, broken.
No, let me interrupt you here for a second. So, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing your story. And what's interesting here, Jim, is that, obviously we're not talking about, we're talking about a particular type of trauma here, which seems to me almost like what, a shock to your identity.
A shock to my whole system, I think.
Your whole system.
Yeah.
Right. But
and I think, in all honesty, I think I also experienced some temporary brain damage that night. I think that's true. I don't, and I've through therapy that I've done subsequently as an adult, we basically drew that conclusion that I probably did have some temporary brain damage.
Due to what?
I'm sorry?
Brain damage due to what?
The shock of that evening, the fact that it was 15 degrees below zero and I'm running around outside with almost no clothes on, sucking in frigid air in a pure state of panic, may have caused some kind of temporary brain damage. I don't know, but I think that's likely.
Mm-hmm. So you see a therapist who in part is kind of accurate, and at least they were able to identify something akin to trauma.
Right.
But you obviously didn't grow out of it, and you said it kind of lingered. You felt symptomatically. What did you experience after that?
Unwelcome thoughts, crazy thoughts would come to me, and I think that's potentially part of the brain damage issue that might have happened. And just really very strange feelings inside. These I don't know if I describe it as anxiety, although it kind of felt a little bit like that. Mm-hmm. I just felt something inside was wrong. Wow. And I honestly believed at the time that it's almost like a switch had flipped, and I went from being quote unquote normal to broken, damaged, and that haunted me and frankly scared me. I was like, I don't know if I'll ever get over this.
At what point did you begin to seek or find help that actually quote unquote worked?
Right. So over the course of my life as a young adult, I had seen 2 or 3 therapists, and I kind of, scratched the surface a little bit. But I still felt like something wasn't right. And I did have a therapist when I was in Massachusetts before I had remarried, and just before I had left that marriage, which was a very dysfunctional marriage, unfortunately. I saw a therapist that I really connected with, and it was the first therapist that I ever felt like I really connected with.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really good relationship with him, and we did a lot of good work. And I remember saying to him, his name was Bob, and I said, Bob, I gotta tell you something. There's something here in me that talk therapy can't touch. Mm-hmm. Just is not touching at all. And I don't understand it, and it really frustrated me because I felt like I'd done a lot of work, and I felt like there was some part of me that just wasn't getting it. And he said to me, well, what I think you need is EMDR. And at this point in time, I had started to read about trauma, mm-hmm. And I had read about different therapeutic and somatic processes like EMDR and whatnot. And I remember reading one book. When I read the section about EMDR, I put the book down and I said to myself, I think I need that. Mm-hmm. But I never did anything about it until maybe a year later or whatever. He happened to mention it to me. And he said, unfortunately, he was not a trained EMDR therapist. So he said, and I had moved to Maine at that point. And he said, I really think you benefit from seeing somebody who does EMDR. So I did. And I found a therapist in Portland who was awesome. She was fabulous. And I did EMDR with her on and off for 5 or 6 years. And I stuck with it, even though part of me didn't want to, because EMDR is a very strange therapeutic process, I gotta tell you. And it's all about unlocking this stuff that's trapped in your body. And boy, when I started to unlock some of that stuff, holy smokes. Mm. The things that were happening in therapy were like, oh my God, what is this? But it was this, I was tapping into all of this stuff that had remained frozen inside, just started to come out. And at first it was difficult to do because it's really freaky. You start shaking and just, it's a very strange thing, but it helps. It helped a lot.
What's interesting, Jim, here is, this is I think it's when we talk about trauma, I think it's very easy to weigh different types of trauma, abuse. I was bullied as a young kid, and sometimes it's easy for me to feel, well, I wasn't sexually abused, therefore, right. How can I complain type thing? Excuse me. But what to me is very interesting here is, you went through this experience of all of a sudden you're in college, married, a kid, everything shifts. And this really, terrified you and impacted you and traumatized you. And how things moved on in your life, how things unfolded, they did so in such a way where you were cognizant that something was going on.
Right.
And you did get help. You had that wherewithal to do that. And so I'm kind of untangling this because a lot of listeners here, look, everyone's gone through their own stuff and a lot of people have experienced different traumas. But what was it for you that allowed you to take the step? And we're not talking yesterday, we're talking like in the 60s and 70s. What was it that allowed you to say, you know what, I need to get some friggin' help here?
Because I didn't want to stay broken. I just didn't want to feel how I felt. I didn't, even though, if you looked at me from the outside, if you didn't know me, you would have looked at me and gone, this guy's got it made. I had a great job. I had my own business. I was very successful. I had a 25-year acting career. I was very involved in the community. To the outside world, I had it made. I had a home on the ocean in Maine. I had it made. But I didn't feel that way. I still felt broken. And I just didn't want to keep feeling that way. I wanted to, if there was a way of I don't want to use the word overcoming because I don't think that's the right word, but if there's a way to not have this always playing in the background, I want to do it. And I stuck it out. Some of the therapy was really hard. And I had a really good therapist, and she helped me a great deal. What was really interesting was, so I kind of got to the point where I felt like I had, quote unquote, graduated from EMDR. And about 6 or 8 months later, and this was very disturbing to me, I still felt like something wasn't right. And boy, knowing that, my trigger was always, you're broken, you're messed up, you're screwed up, you can't be fixed. So after doing all this therapy, I still felt like something was missing, and that was very unsettling. And I went back to my therapist and I said, this is how I'm feeling. And I'm not happy about it at all. And she said that she had a colleague who did BrainSpotting. And she and I had talked about neuroscience before, the neuroscience impact of trauma. And I think we're only really scratching the surface on that right now these days. I didn't know much about it. And so I said, okay. I did some research and I went, oh my God, I thought EMDR was wacky. This is really wacky, this BrainSpotting thing. And I said, well, what do I have to lose? I'll try it. So I did. And it helped me more than any other therapeutic process.
Wow.
In that, I can't tell you how it works. I don't know how it works. I'm not even sure my therapist knows how it works. But it tapped into something in my primitive brain that released. It was really hard. It was even harder than the EMDR therapy that I had done. But I also knew there was something there. If you want to call it for me, the missing link, this was the missing link. It was somehow tapping into the part of my brain that was frozen in trauma in a way that you can't say to yourself, okay, I'm going to do that. Right. It's just, there's something about the way the BrainSpotting process works that, she would hold up like a wand with a ball on the top of it, and she would move that in my field of vision. And whenever it got to the left side of my vision, about halfway across that field of vision, it was like a lightning bolt hit me. I was like, what is that? But I knew somehow she was tapping into something that I was completely unable to connect to before. And probably did BrainSpotting maybe 8 times. But boy, it somehow the fog started to vaporize.
How are you, as we kind of wind down here, let me ask you, how are you doing now?
I'm much better now. I'm present. I'm very happy in terms of my life. I have my life. I've remarried. I found my soulmate. We've been married now for 12 years.
Wow.
I live on the ocean in Maine. I do a lot of volunteer work, and I feel quote unquote normal.
Right.
I'm not quote unquote all better.
Right.
The trauma is still there.
Yeah.
It doesn't ever really go away, I don't think, but it softens. It just isn't in the forefront. It's way, way, way in the background somewhere.
Before you mentioned was it your second marriage?
Yes.
Okay. You said that didn't work. And
it was a very dysfunctional marriage.
And do you feel in part that was because of your own trauma?
I think so. Trauma and immaturity in that, as I look back, I recognized the flaws before I got married. And I knew there were potentially damaging flaws in that relationship. But finally, for the first time in my life, I felt like someone actually loved me. I'd never felt that before in my life. And that oversaw anything else. That was, I didn't know it at the time, but that was more important to me than paying attention to what the other signs were kind of looming there that said this might not be the best match. And it wasn't. And I don't, I'm not blaming anybody for that. I'm as much to blame as anybody else. But after I moved past that, I really started to find my real footing in life, and was fortunate enough to have found my wife, and it's like, oh my God, this is what being in love really is.
Wow.
This is what vulnerable is. I was 56 years old, and I hadn't experienced that before in my life.
Wow. What do you say to people listening who've maybe experienced trauma and they're not sure of how to get help? Maybe they don't even want to admit that they're traumatized.
Right.
What do you say to them?
I say there are many different therapies out there, and EMDR and BrainSpotting work for me. That doesn't mean they're going to work for somebody else. Right. We all have our own mix, our own concoction of what we bring to the table. But if you feel like you need help, try to find it. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And being a male, I think, a lot of men don't want to admit that there's something wrong. Right. That's not the manly thing to do. Right. But if you feel like there's something that isn't working in your life and you're not able to connect with how to make that better, try to find a therapeutic process that can. And there's many, many, many different kinds of therapies. And for me, because of my traumatic experience, talk therapy really didn't do it. It was more the somatic processes like EMDR and BrainSpotting that allowed me to get to the stuff that was stuck inside my body that I didn't know was stuck inside my body. Right. So for me, that's what worked. But that doesn't mean that it's going to work for somebody else. I think you have to find your own path. And it can be frustrating. Right. Because you can, just because you see a therapist doesn't mean that that's the right connection or the right therapeutic process or even the right therapist.
Exactly.
And stick with it. Stick with it. Don't give up on yourself, because there is a path. You just have to find yours. And my EMDR therapist told me that she admired me, and I'd always felt strange, but that I stuck with it, that I didn't give up, that I just kept at it.
Well, and I second that. I mean, I admire you too, because it's really challenging, and you're right on. It's very difficult to find a therapist that you connect with, and that's a major part of it. So look, I want to thank you for sharing your story, man. It's a really personal story, and I think it takes a lot of guts to come on here and talk about this stuff.
Right.
I really do believe that. Look, James, as we kind of close out here, if people are interested in contacting you and reaching out to you, can they do that? Number one, and number two, how would they do that?
Absolutely. So I'll give you my email address.
Okay.
It's Jim, my first name, Jim Stewart, Stewart, Maine, like the state of Maine, Maina, Jim Stewart, Maine @gmail.com. Okay. One of my goals in life now is to share what I've learned. I've learned so much. There's a part of me that says, God, I wish I didn't have to learn all this stuff.
Right.
But I have. And there's probably a lot of people out there like me. I never thought that. I always thought I was the only one. Yeah. There's probably a lot of other people out there like me who, if they hear this story, it touches them. They resonate. They understand. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about
I appreciate that. And I'll have your email linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Jim, thank you so much. I admire you truly, and I appreciate you coming on here.
Thank you. I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad that you did it for me. Thank you.
Take care.
You too.